Welcome to the place where you'll hear from HR leaders, people experts, and wellbeing professionals. You'll learn about their personal and professional journeys, hear about the future of HR and wellbeing, and take away actionable insights and tips. This is the HR and Wellbeing Insider Podcast. Hi, Jamie. Thank you for coming on to the HR and Wellbeing Insider Podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Pleasure to be here today with you.
Brilliant. And for our audience today, Jamie is the head of health and wellbeing in a large corporate business. And he's here today to tell us a little bit about him and touch on a couple of really important and topical subjects right now. But first of all, Jamie, it'd be great to understand a little bit more about you personally and from an organization perspective. So, how did you get into your role and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, it's a great question and something actually you don't really get asked as wellbeing lead. Not many people ask that question. And I think it's because people assume a wellbeing lead has no lived experience in wellbeing as such. At least that's my personal take on it. So a bit of humor. I like a bit of humor in my analogies and introductions. So my X Factor story, my Britain's Got Talent story is I'm from the Northeast originally. I grew up in Northumberland. I was in a family where we had a lot of a genetic predisposition to autoimmune disease. My mum was a carer and had to quit work at the age of 29. My dad had rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 30. And where that connects to now is basically I grew up where he had knee hip replacements from the age of me being born. I saw the impact of that both emotionally. I then became fascinated with well-being, more lifestyle, and how that could relate to disease, and especially autoimmune disease from a young age, around about the age of 6. My sister had type 1 diabetes, hence from the age of 4, due to just genetic factors. So it was a fascination from a young age on well-being and the role that diet could play in physical activity and mitigation, support those symptoms. And I made a career out of it. So I went to Leeds. I studied in Leeds on undergrad in a health and wellbeing degree. And then I did a master's at Leeds Beckett in nutrition and public health. I then spent many years in public health in London, jumping around councils, doing public health roles, a lot of weight management and some commissioning bits before jumping into the corporate space for around about 6 years as a wellbeing lead. And there's a lot of transferable skills between the two. If you ever be in public health, you'll realize when you come to the corporate world, especially on procurement, on data analysis, if anything, the public health world is probably more rigorous at times on some areas. And that got me where I am today, really.
Fascinating background. And it's interesting there you talk about that personal story and how it sort of influenced to where you are today. How important do you think it is, just on that point, for health and wellbeing leaders in the corporate world to have lived experience? And that could be family, friends, physical, mental wellbeing. But how important do you think that is?
I think it's important. I don't think it's everything. And I'll caveat that we're right. Why? I guess some people will fall into the role where perhaps we could argue they've had more privileged background or socioeconomic factors, or things I haven't described there based on my window of the world and how I was shaped. And they could still run in the role with knowing the white papers and the best practice and data analysis and be a real critical thinker and do well. But I think where lived experience helps to combine the two together between science and storytelling, I think it's good to have that background because you can really resonate with your people voice a bit more and feel the pain of that and feel the emotional connection to that, as well as the using your bread and butter skills of data analysis and critical thinking and looking at the evidence base. So I try not to pit them against each other too much in terms of science and storytelling, but I do think it's a key experience to support the role, and blending the two together is a skill set, I think, as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really, really, really great answer. Really fascinating. You talked there about lifestyle, diet, and the impact that has on our well-being and conditions and our health and wider health. The big thing is with health and well-being is we think about from an organizational perspective, when we think about health and well-being, mental health, physical health, and we think about employee benefits in particular, access to private healthcare, which you sort of touched on, public and private there, but private healthcare, things like that. Lifestyle and diet is really an individual choice. Would you agree with that? Is it an individual choice? There are other factors, but lifestyle and diet are two big things that I don't see enough of when we think about employee well-being. So from my experience looking into corporates, I don't see a lot of the time people talking about diet, and lifestyle factors.
Yeah.
How big are those factors when we think about our well-being?
Yeah, I think they're huge. And naturally, as a data-driven person, given I've got degrees in this area that are transferable skills, I think of models, I think of white papers to answer your question. So some that stand out might be like the TTM, the trans-theoretical model, or behavior change models to answer that question, or the circle of control model. Ultimately, you're saying, no, what's in your circle of control? Can you influence that? Can you not? And diet and physical activity. There'll be some factors, some people would argue it is in your circle of control, right? Because you can cook at home and that's in your circle of control. But then there'll be arguably things that people will say it's only in the circle of influence in terms of have you got the money to pay for that food and that luxury of what's defined as a balanced diet that feeds your gut microbiome and your mental health and all that new emerging evidence. So I guess it's a complex question, and I've given you a bit of a political answer. But I think it's both really, and depend on who you are, your individual factors around you, whether that's socioeconomic factors or something else, or the environment, you'll answer that question differently from your window of the world lens. From my perspective, I do often see the behavior change challenge more of a question on the COM-B model on capability, opportunity that equals motivation to result in the behavior as the biggest challenge rather than the other factors that I mentioned on sort of finance and background coming into play. Hence why most leads question themselves on, how do we get engagement and how do we influence this behavior? Thinking of those models I quoted before. I hope that answers it in a very roundabout way.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And that's a really interesting point, actually. And I think it's great to use the research that's out there. And I sort of dived straight in there into that question just off the back of your first answer. However, what I'd like to get into is I was going to ask you why health and well-being. And I think you answered that in your initial intro. But what gets you excited in your role, head of health and well-being in a large corporate? What actually gets you out of bed? Why is it exciting? Why do you do what you do?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And it's getting me thinking back into childhood as well as present and as past. And I've asked myself this many times. I think when it comes down to it, not that I often hear of it in a sort of global strategic role at the moment, but the success stories is what reminds you of why you're in the role. And that then takes me back to little Jamie in the Northeast, who was, I guess feeling some strain on those autoimmune diseases and what I could do about it in terms of interventions and how I could support my family. And when you hear that success story on that storytelling piece, which I know there's a balance between science and storytelling, that does get you out of bed. That's what gives me that motivation to say, this intervention we've put in place, although at a high level there's challenges, an individual level there's benefits, and hearing that story keeps you going. It gives you momentum from that motivation to do something different, to do something more for employee well-being and workplace well-being. So I think most people will answer that with a similar response on, it's that individual success story. But the other side of it that gets me out of bed is I'm very curious from my university days on what works and what doesn't per data piece and per data analysis and white papers. And that side of me, which was developed during my early 20s, is still here now in my late 30s. And that gets me out of bed because I'm always curious to say, well, yes, it didn't go well, but I think there's learnings now on what didn't go well as what did go well. And often on LinkedIn debates and personas and marketing, I don't often hear or see what didn't go well and what was the learning. I see what did go well in workplace well-being and what was the learning. And I think we need to get more comfortable with both on my side of the fence and perhaps the vendor's side of the fence, stating what didn't go well, but here's what we learned from it in terms of workplace well-being, I think.
Yeah, and you talk about storytelling and data and science and the difference. I personally think storytelling is really important. I've also had people say to me, Paul, these people you work with, heads of HR, heads of wellbeing, heads of health and safety, it's all politics. It's corporate politics. It's data. It's meetings for meeting's sake. Are they really making a difference, or are they just pushing emails around? And that was surprising for me when I had that feedback. So those stories from your position, how do you bring those stories out, those individual stories within an organization? How would you or your what would your advice be to others? How do they bring those stories out and actually use those success stories to influence others and show the value of corporate health and wellbeing?
Yeah, I guess naturally on strategic level, I'm thinking of that, and also on your question on directly, how do you just bring that out in terms of showing the success? So strategically, I'm thinking when I'm thinking about gap analysis. So most workplace wellbeing leads will be thinking, well, what does my organization need? What's the people needs and wants based on either risk the organization or the employees or employee voice. And I think naturally I take a blend of tapping into your D&I networks who are those lived experience expertise, but also not letting them dominate the, I guess, gap analysis. It's a very fine balance of hearing someone and then obviously having the softer skills of not shutting that person down at all on hearing that opinion, but balancing that population voice with the key data sets on your other sources where frameworks are working well and best practice for things like gap analysis or even procurement when you're going after an intervention. In terms of the second part of that, I think bringing the success story in, and getting the balance right there. Naturally, again, because I'm very data driven, I also in the business case of, well, this is why it worked well. I also, in my experience, present my business case with a balance of a mixture of case studies, but then harder hitting evidence that are more representative, thinking about those bread and butter skills at university of sample size and quantitative data mixed with qualitative. And I think getting the balance right is a skill, and a skill when you're connected in with health and wellbeing forums and groups, you continue to grow and think, well, I haven't quite mastered that yet, and I could have really presented that differently. But in short, I think balancing case studies with some stronger data sets is the best way to showcase that sort of softer return of value or return investment blend in between.
Yeah, really important. I think that data plus case study brought together is actually the really valuable part of that answer. So yeah, I would totally agree. And in terms of your experience, Jamie, so thinking about corporate health and wellbeing, workplace health and wellbeing, what do you think the biggest challenges are at the moment for health and wellbeing leaders?
Yeah, yeah. And something I'm always thinking about every day, and most leaders are. So for me, naturally, when I think of that question, I think again, what's the data set saying? And wellbeing leads will probably think, what's my data set internally saying versus what's the white papers coming out externally in the data around us. And a lot of societal factors influence that as well in that data. So for me, the theme that's really coming out from the wellbeing forum groups that I'm a part of with other leads and what I'm seeing externally validated through sort of government policy and government pain points is absence and sickness absence. I think that the landscape and the biggest challenge is getting back to that bread and butter of sickness absence and looking at that of what works well to address that. And we've seen that in the NHS just this year. They've launched their own management toolkits, try to tackle that. And we see that in the Treasury debates at the moment. And obviously, I think, Paul, you commented yourself on LinkedIn recently on the waiting list for NHS staff, influenced by NHS staff as well, who are on sick leave. And those societal factors do have a loop and a feedback into the workplace. And then it's for the wellbeing lead, which is a continued debate I see on LinkedIn and forums of where does the workplace start and stop on that support, which is still an ongoing debate that policy makers perhaps might answer one day. And I'm in that camp of hoping for a bit more guidance. And there is risks to that, but there's also benefits. And I think sickness absence is the key theme. But there comes with that is opportunity as well. Opportunity to showcase that workplace well-being, if we get it right, doesn't just have benefit for the organization because of the data I'm showing you, but the societal factors facing our UK economy at the moment has benefit there. So I think there's a big hook and play for me on ESG and that social value side at the moment. And I'm hoping that this podcast will kind of put that front of mind for a lot of wellbeing leads to get back to perhaps that sickness absence foundation and connect that into that wider external factors that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, massively. And I've got a point written down here. So the latest CIPD report just released 9.4 days sick per employee, up from 7.8 days in the last report. So sickness absence seems to be going in the wrong direction. And I think also that societal part is really important. And where does the workplace start and stop? Because if you've got people waiting on NHS waiting lists to get treatment, that means they're off work. Then, of course, if they can access benefits through work and get treated quicker, then they can get back to work quicker. So there are clear benefits for workplace health and well-being. But also, some business leaders ask the question, well, why should we provide all of these benefits? And by
Mm,
providing, a range of different benefits, there is, of course, a direct cost to the employer. And with national insurance contributions going up, et cetera, have businesses got the funds to pay for more benefits and wellbeing solutions? And yeah, I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think it's a really, really difficult one. The other challenge there, I think you've sort of talked about, or that will come up here now, is health and wellbeing providers. So people like me, and with my background as an expert in employee health and wellbeing, I've been an employee benefits broker and a consultant. I've worked for different providers. And as a health and wellbeing lead, you're getting hammered by providers day in, day out on LinkedIn, on email, on the phone. Buy now, buy now, buy now. How do you see that? Is it a really, really big challenge? Or actually, is it, it's not too bad and it's okay? And do you welcome those opportunities? Talk to me about that side of things.
yeah, definitely. And I think that relates nicely back to our first point on storytelling versus science. So you're right, the status quo validated through the wellbeing forums at the moment. And I've just heard lately, I'll not name the event, but I've heard an exhibition has closed its doors lately on a similar theme of leads felt oversold to and a bit like a cattle market. They're going through, they're not getting best practice out of it, and they're just being sold to on my intervention's the best. It's going to get you the best impact for your workplace being needs. So I really think there's opportunity there to get it right, and there will be vendors that will have a lot of data and impact to say, I can't make this right for you. Your gaps there, your analysis there, your data there, I can get it right and have some impact in your organization. But I think the mechanisms that you described there, or the opportunities for the circle of trust between vendor and leads, is quite limited, and almost to the extent now where I've personally felt a bit like when I get the charity guy at the door, I'm closing my blinds on that. And I think that's not a great position to be in for the wider good of workplace well-being. We need to be coming together to find the best solutions and the best practice. And that has to be a better relationship now between vendor and leads, if you like, or intervention and leads. But I don't think the process or the opportunity, even at broker level or exhibition level, or definitely not LinkedIn and cold calling, is there, because well-being leads are humans. We know that it's a lonely role. We know that we're often one or two people. So if you're on the vendor side of the fence, Paul, which I know you've described beautifully, you need to come to sense with the reality of, if that lead's getting 25 LinkedIn messages a week, what's going to stand up for them with my message, and how am I going to get my at least foot in the door to be heard on my data and my impact. So I think something needs to change there on allowing the wellbeing lead to look at the market and think at a scalable pace and think, what is the right intervention for the organization? And I say intervention, it could be pairing with a consultant who's more SME and safety or L&D. It doesn't have to be a benefit as such as a technology or an intervention in those words. And I think there's real opportunity based on those challenges I've described to get that right, really.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I can see it from both sides of the fence. People like you, you're busy, you're working in a role which can be very lonely sometimes, but also then we've got providers who are passionate about making a difference and wanting to speak to people like you. And there are only certain ways to do that. Do they pay thousands of pounds to be at an exhibition where you've already talked about actually, people like you going through the door just being sold to, so it doesn't quite work? Or do they then reach out on LinkedIn? But I think the key point you've talked about is that circle of trust. And there is a need for both. There is a need for, providers, vendors, and well-being leads to talk and discuss. And I'm hoping this is maybe you've heard it here first, but you've come up with something on this front, Jamie. You've come up with a solution, I think. So tell us about what you've been working on and how it will help health and well-being leads.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. And yeah, so I've got a bit of a double hat role. I've had a freelance role in stealth mode for the past year. I've had the idea for perhaps 2 years. If anyone wants to ask me that, there's been a lot of LinkedIn messages between the lines on challenging a few people to get a bite to that idea. So about 8 months ago, I got an entrepreneur to bite that idea. And the solution I've come up with is a pre-procurement workplace wellbeing platform that, as you say, enables that circle of trust between a vendor and lead. And the best way to describe it for everyone listening today is it's almost Go Compare meets workplace wellbeing procurement from the pre-stage. So that request for information, request for proposal stage. And the beauty of it is it's not just built on metrics, which is already being created on filtering in terms of what my needs are. Is it mental well-being? Is it what in that? Is it PTSD? Is it something else? Or price point, for example. The beauty of it is it's calling all leads. So D&I, procurement, benefit, people leads, those responsible for the contract to have that lived experience of what went well in that contract and what didn't, and what's the learnings, to review the vendors by metrics that mattered in procurement. So things like impact data. What was the analysis used for that impact data? Uptake and engagement. What was the book of business promise? Well, you promised 40% and then they would deliver 20%, And then, of course, price clarity is a point as well, because from what I've heard on the fence on the wellbeing forums is vendors will often come in with a price and then 6 months later that price is being tweaked and it's not sustainable for the vendor, and the lead then has the risk of the reputation and the damage of going back to the business and either putting another business case forward or trying to get the egg off their face and saying, this hasn't worked well, but I was told the price increase has now come up at the same time. So the platform itself is called OneSpace. It's free for leads. It's also free for vendors. And I think my mission statement from the start, from looking at the environment over the past 2 years, is why should workplace wellbeing be gatekept, in the sense of why should you upfront and pay to get in front of leads if you are doing quality work based on data? And that comes from a relationship perspective on commercial bias, or paying upfront for a ticket, or a subscription model. So we're not a subscription model. It's free for the leads, free for the vendor, but there is a win cost for the vendor if they win business to sustain the cost around the platform itself. And that's as pretty much as transparent as I can be on the platform, because it is trying to create transparency. So it needs to be transparent itself on, well, what's the catch? When I've been talking about this behind the scenes, everyone say, well, no, that's not right. What's the catch? There isn't a catch. It's trying to do the best for workplace well-being outcomes rather than profit first, which is the models that I'm currently seeing being rolled out, trying to bridge this gap as well.
Love it. Absolutely love it, Jamie. And I think it's a great opportunity to build that trust between vendor and wellbeing leads. And also for your peers, for health and wellbeing and benefits leads out there, what a great way to look at new providers by using this one piece of technology, looking at the data and metrics, looking at that peer-to-peer review. What a great way without any bias. It sounds great. So, I mean, in terms of, so a couple of things. So health and wellbeing leads, how do they get involved? Vendors, if they're interested, if they're watching, how do they get involved? And what does the launch and rollout look like?
So at the moment, we're in early adopters phase. What I mean by that is we've got around about 10 leads and 10 vendors went into the platform and really told us what's working well, what's not, and what's missing. And the real call to action is just message me on LinkedIn, private message me, and then I'll send you the sign up link. We'll put the live link under Paul's podcast, and you can literally just sign up for free. Put in your email address, put in your organization, and sign up. I would say even if you're just window shopping and you are just looking at the market, there's benefit for you to sign up for free from the leads perspective, so you can really scale those metrics and compare who is making a difference in organizations. And I think it's also a good gap while we're waiting for perhaps white papers and data quality to catch up. Why not rely on your fellow SMEs to say, well, this is what worked well in my organization, and looking at those metrics on the platform, you can justify the risk a little bit more, perhaps the risk you're taking on an intervention or a consultant or a provider itself. So I am really positive about it. And I'm really excited about the launch. And yeah, please do just sign up on the link and by messaging myself.
Sounds really, really good. Jamie, today you've talked about your personal experience from family life to where you are now, to your studies and research. We've talked about the challenges in workplace wellbeing and the opportunities. And I think there is a mass of opportunity out there for health and wellbeing leaders and for the right providers in the market. And OneSpace, it sounds exciting. It sounds great. Can't wait to get in and have a look around, see the launch. And yes, you are right. We'll put the link in the show notes for everybody. We'll put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. But been really great to talk to you and hear from you, and look forward to speaking to you again soon, and maybe even an episode 2 all about OneSpace in a bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. I'll take you up on that. And yeah, look forward to speaking again soon. Cheers now. Take care.
Thanks for coming on, Jamie. Thank you for listening to the HR and Wellbeing Insider podcast. Look out for the next episode, and in the meantime, sign up to our newsletter in the comments below to hear more from our guests and news and tips on HR and wellbeing. See you in the next episode.